Hello, so this video is about An Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley, and it's about the older generation, two characters in particular, and you might want to watch this connected with another one which is about the younger generation. Anyway, just along the top there I've put three different dates and they're the contexts that you need to think about. 1912, the year that the play is set, so all the characters live in 1912. 1946, the year the play was first performed, and then today. Okay, I want you to be thinking about you shouldn't make any assumptions about the way characters behave just based on the way you think about the world. It's not the same thing at all, and so we need to think about these characters in the world that they live in. I've just put a slide with a few of the kind of themes and subject areas that questions tend to come from. And you can see them all there. You've got mothers and children, fathers and children, and obviously questions could be asked in all sorts of different ways, but if you dig deep enough you'll probably find that they've got these themes at their root. So that's family really, isn't it? Mothers and children, fathers and children. Secrets and the idea of hypocrisy and kind of saying one thing and doing another. Power and class, that's very important in this play. Responsibility and blame, who takes the blame, who accepts responsibility, who doesn't accept responsibility. Youth versus age, which is mainly what this presentation is about, certainly on the age side of things. And then optimism versus pessimism. Optimism, the future is bright. Pessimism, the future is bleak, everything is terrible. Okay, or maybe somewhere in between. But those are the key areas that you need to think about when you're planning an answer to An Inspector Calls. So here are two members of the older generation, Mr Birling and Mrs Birling, Arthur and Sybil. And they do all they can to protect the values they believe in. But as we will see, the inspector's purpose is to make them realise that their values are wrong. It's his job to open up their consciences, but as we shall see, it's not an easy task. So here we have Arthur Birling, a manufacturer, and at the beginning of this play powerful and commanding and making lots of speeches and seeming to lecture everybody, particularly the younger generation. So he's a manufacturer, and one of the first things he says, he's looking forward to lower costs and higher prices. His daughter's marriage to Gerald Croft will make that even easier. He believes it's a fantastic match that will make him more money, essentially. He talks about himself as a hard-headed businessman. I can't imagine him making too many heartfelt decisions. Most of what he makes are very factual based and not full of emotion. But he is also an optimist. He believes that the future is going to be bright. He also believes that he might be in line for a knighthood, so he will be Sir Arthur Birling if everything goes according to plan, which of course we know it probably won't, because that's what the playwright is doing here. Priestley's planting the clue that things are going to go wrong. Now we also know that he's got no time for socialism, or its more extreme version, communism, because he says the way some of these cranks talk, the word crank is the idea of somebody who's a fool or an idiot or somebody who's crazy, and he says, he uses this idea of it as if we're all mixed up together like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. Notice the word nonsense there suggests that he just does not believe any of these ideas are worth anything. In other words, you look after yourself and your family, but you expect everybody else to do the same. That way you don't have to look after them. And we learn, of course, that he sacked Eva Smith for getting involved in a strike. And he says, I can't accept any responsibility for what happened to her. He does not see that his role had anything to do with her death. And he's very matter of fact. He says, so she had to go. It's a simple case. It's as if everyone should agree with him. He's expecting people to agree with him. He can't believe that they don't. And he tries to explain himself. He says if they don't come down sharply on some of these people, they'd soon be asking for the earth, asking for more than they deserve. But what he really means is taking it off of him, which is another example of him trying to protect his position, his power, his money and his influence. And he does that also by trying to fight back against the inspector, but the inspector is too good for him, too strong, and we see that he begins, Birling becomes angry. He says angrily at the bottom, I don't like the tone or the way you're handling this inquiry. He's not used to being treated like this. He's never been treated with this, as he would see it, lack of respect. But actually this is just somebody giving as good as they get, and it's unlikely that Birling has ever really experienced it before. But of course, as stories come out and we learn that the family isn't quite as it seems, he becomes less sure. You can see that the stage direction at the top says dubiously. When he finds out what his wife has done, he says the press might easily take it out. The press is the newspapers. He's thinking that this story will find its way into the paper and it might challenge his very good chance of a knighthood. So we see that he tries to use his power again. I've got to cover this up as soon as I can. This is hypocrisy. This is covering something up. This is saying one thing and doing another. But I suppose that his power can help him to do that. He becomes very angry with Eric and the things that he's done. Again, we can see that we've got this phrase, there'll be a public scandal. The idea that other people find out what they're really like is something that is beginning to seriously bother him. And he continues in this vein and gets more angry. And then we see that we realise that maybe something stranger is going on. And he tries to work all this out with Gerald. Remember, Gerald comes back at the end and that man wasn't a police officer, he says. And so Birling starts to work out who could possibly treat us like this. And he says that the inspector was probably a socialist or some sort of crank. So we've got that word crank repeated, some sort of crazy person. And he even says he talked like one, as if his views were of a socialist nature. So that's kind of what he begins to think. And then he kind of believes that he's won in some way, because he says the whole story is just a lot of moonshine, nothing but an elaborate sell. That, in other words, it was just a trick. Now we know, because Sheila helps us to realise this, that everything that's happened really happened. Maybe not to one girl, maybe to a series of different girls. We can't ever really prove that. But the treatment of someone by the Birlings is definite, because they tell us about it. So all these things seem to be true. He's just worried that they would become public, and now he's certain that they won't. He becomes happy and jovial again. As you can see, we've got the word jovial and second bottom quote there on the right. Jovial means he's happy again. And he even does an impersonation of the inspector and tries to make everybody laugh by saying, "You all helped kill her." Don't get that quote confused. He's joking here. He's doing an impersonation of the inspector. And he wants his family to lighten up, to laugh about it. So we go full circle from this pink and intimate atmosphere at the beginning of the play. He wants everybody to be happy again at the end. His final quote is kind of proof that he doesn't really take any of this seriously. He says, "Now look at the pair of them," meaning his children, "the famous younger generation who know it all, and they can't even take a joke." So the older generation, constantly doing everything it can with its power and its money and its influence to protect its reputation, being hypocritical and kind of calling anything else ridiculous or foolish or stupid, and not really treating the views of their own children, old as they are, they're not babies, these two, treating these views as ridiculous. Now, Mrs Birling, Sybil Birling, is a slightly more extreme version of what we've just been talking about with Arthur. She's a formidable woman to go up against, and we'll see as we go through some of these quotations just what I mean by that. So we see her in the beginning, and we see she's reproaching her husband straight away, because we know that she is actually more socially superior. She's married beneath her, as the phrase used to be. So when Arthur is nice about some of the cooking, she says, "Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things." It's just something she doesn't want him to say in front of Gerald. It would suggest that they're not as good as Gerald. And she's not frightened to tell him so in public. She also doesn't like being questioned. She says to her daughter, "Please don't contradict me like that." In other words, I don't expect you to pick me up if you think I'm wrong. That shouldn't happen. Notice she says please, but she doesn't really mean it. It's kind of an order hidden in a request. And then she uses this phrase, "girls of that class." This is an example of her not really understanding the working class, as if they're of a different species, these people, then they're not really people at all, perhaps. And one of the things that we learn is that Mrs Birling doesn't like impertinence. "That's a trifle impertinent," she says, which means rude and not respectful. You're not respectful towards who I am. You should realise who I am and be more respectful towards me. And at the minute she says trifle impertinent, which means a little bit. Okay. However, when we realise that the woman Eric got pregnant went to see her to ask for help for money, she doesn't realise who she is, of course, but she goes to see her to ask for help. She sees it as a gross piece of impertinence. So we've gone from trifle impertinent to gross, which means massive. And all she's done is, and I don't blame her, I suppose, is pretend she was married. This girl pretends she is married, and she uses the first name that she thinks of, which is, of course, the father's surname. And this absolutely infuriates Mrs Birling, because she's sitting opposite a fake Mrs Birling, which, as far as she's concerned, there is only one, and it's her. She also turns on her own family. She says, unlike the other three, I did nothing I'm ashamed of. In other words, she believes everybody else has something to be ashamed of, and not her. So she's kind of openly admitting that her own children and her husband, and I think she's also talking about Gerald, should be ashamed of themselves. But she sets herself apart from all this, and she stands up to the inspector. She also lies to the inspector. She's one of the few who refuses to admit that she recognises the photograph, even though she saw the girl 2 weeks before. She, however, is very foolish, because we watch her get her own son into deep trouble as she becomes more and more sanctimonious and pious, the way that she talks about the poor standards of the father. And we very quickly realise, once we get the mention of drink, that it's her own son. So she says, go and look for the father of the child, it's his responsibility. And so I think both Priestley and the inspector particularly enjoy making this woman look ridiculous and kind of upsetting her normal behaviours. Because we get more examples of how she just does not see Eva Smith, Daisy Renton, whatever name we choose to give to the girl. She doesn't see her as a human being who has any of the same qualities. Notice the quotation at the top on the right. She was giving herself ridiculous airs. In other words, she was behaving politely, I suspect. She was trying to basically get some help from the committee, and which was simply absurd in a girl in her position. She had no right to do that. It was ridiculous. She was laughing at this girl who desperately needed her help. And yet again we get another example, just like Mr Birling, that she accepts no responsibility. You're quite wrong to suppose I shall regret what I did. And then just below that, I accept no blame for it at all. So we get this sense that she believes in her worldview, very similar to her own husband's worldview, that she has a status that deserves to be respected, and anyone not doing that is simply not good enough. And there's our quote about the drunken young idler. It's very quick that we realise she's talking about her own son. And then something I always find interesting is she gets very excited when she says, Eric, you stole money? She's just been told what he's really done, which is to get a woman pregnant in a most unpleasant circumstances. And she chooses to focus on the money from their own family. And it's as if that's the worst of crime that he's committed, which always makes me wonder where her morals and her scruples are. And then towards the end it says, from the way you children talk, you might be wanting to help him, meaning the inspector, instead of us. She doesn't realise that she's losing them, that there is a divide, that actually they've got different philosophies, different ideas, different beliefs, and she can't quite understand it. And then at the end she reverts to treating them like little children again. She says they're overtired. In the morning they'll be as amused as we are, which I think shows that she hasn't learnt anything, not only from the inspector, but she hasn't learnt anything from her own children who are trying to teach her that she needs to change. She doesn't change. She's very much in the same lines as her own husband. They stand firm, they believe that they've been tricked, that nothing they've done is wrong, and they're prepared to carry on and get up tomorrow morning as if nothing has happened.